Okay, so in this video, we're going to actually do a little bit more. We're going to finish up our gameplay framework and talk about player state, which is where we're going to store our score. And then we're actually going to implement this, meaning implement a way for when our pawn collides with this taco blueprint, we're going to increase our score by 1. And so the last thing I want to talk about is player state. So player state is kind of the last piece of the gameplay framework. So player state is, let's make this larger. There we go. So player state is essentially, well, the state of the player, right? So this can be things like, their inventory, or their score, or their health, etc. Player state is replicated to all clients and the server, and it's generally a good place to store, information about the player that we need to change, that changes frequently, right? So this is kind of what we're looking for. That's what we're going to do. So we need to create a new blueprint. Let's go to player, right click, blueprint class, and you notice it's not here in this list. We need to select all classes and then filter it to start typing player, and you'll see player state. Right, mouse over it. A player state is created for every player on a server or in a standalone game. Player states are replicated to all clients and contain network and game relevant information about the players, such as their name and score, etc. So that is what we want. And select it. Let's give it a name, bb_player state. And the next thing we need to do is let's tell our game mode to use that player state, so the default one. So double click on game mode, player state class. We should now see we have our BP player state. Compile that and close. It's not that it's going to actually matter that much, and you're going to see why in a second, because I'm going to introduce a critical killer concept you guys called casting. And that's a way for blueprints to communicate with each other, because what we're going to need to do is let's open our player state here. We're going to want to store variables about the player here. Nothing else is going to happen here except for it's like a dumping ground for our variables. So let's create one now. And what do we want to call it, right? So we want to call it score. But if I try to type score, it says name is already in use. So there's already a default player state class, which this one inherits from. If we mouse it to the right, you see like player state is the parent class. It inherits from that class. So in this case, we need to choose something different. And I guess then I'll choose player score, right? And it's not a Boolean, it's an integer. So let's change that to integer and then compile it. We don't need to make it public. We're going to change it programmatically, I guess, through blueprints. So with that done, we've got our player score. We could add a few others here, but let's just get player score because we know we're going to want to get that value and set it. And having it default to 0 is just fine. If you're doing health, you might want to make it, we'll make it larger than 0, of course. So close that. Let's go back into our player character. And just to kind of remind ourselves where we left off, well, play. Let's see. Yeah, we left off with colliding with this, and we can, with this actor, then we print out a message. So now instead of just printing out a message, we want to increase the score by 1. And the score is held in another blueprint. And so how do we do that? So one way to do this is by using something called casting. And what casting is essentially, it's a way of saying, from one blueprint to say, hey, like I want to call a function, or I want to set a variable or get a variable from another blueprint. And the thing we need to do is, in order to cast that successfully to this other blueprint, this other actor, we need to give that actor, we need to pass in its parent class, right? It's basically like you want to call this, somebody's child, and have them, do you a favor, but they need to ask their parents first. So that's the best way I can think about it. So you need to pass in one of the parents, or the parent class, and then they'll use that parent class to perform this action as if, right? So to start, I think it's best just to show you. So if we do cast, if we start typing cast, you're going to see all sorts of stuff here. So these are all these other, all these actors, all these other classes. We know ours is called player state. It's actually called BP _ player state. And so you see it here. You can see all of our BPs that we made, player character, blah, blah, blah. So we want to choose player state, not the player state class. Select that. And now it's expecting an object. And we'll get to that in a second, but I think what we want to do now is we want to print out something, some kind of string. And if you see as BP player state, so this lets us essentially say, as BP player state, we can grab any variables that happen to be associated with this, or do something as the player state. And in our case, we clearly just want to get the player score. So we type player, and then we see what let's do score. There it is, get player score. So that's our player score variable, and we want to print that out. That's going to tell us if all this gets hooked up and is working. That's going to tell us that we're able to, read that variable. And if we're able to read it, then we're also able to write to it too and change its value. So if I try to compile now, a bunch of errors. Well, one big error, right? So it's telling us that the type of object is undetermined, connect something to it to imply a specific type. So we need to connect something. So if we mouse over, it's saying object wildcard. So as I told you earlier, to cast, you need to pass it an object that it inherits from. So if we go back to our content viewer here, and we go to player state, right? BP player state, double click it. Up in the right, it says, parent class is player state. So we need a way to kind of traverse and get to the player state from this. And in my case, I kind of believe I already know how to do that. And so we're in the player character. And so from the player character, if we're taking our knowledge here from some of the other work in the gameplay framework that we did. So from the player character, we have so we have the player character here, and then we've got the pawn, right? So the player character is a type of pawn, and then the pawn is a type of actor. What we want to do is then we need to get, but the player character, the pawn is controlled by a controller. And if we know the controller, and the player state has, so the player state is going to sit in from the controller here. Okay, so this terrible drawing is basically my thought process of how I can kind of traverse from our character, right? So which is here. Then we want to go to pawn. Then we want to go to controller. Then we can go to the player state, and then that'll get us where we need to be, I think. So let's try. I mean, if you can just kind of try and fail a few times, but let's see, controller, player controller. So I want to get the player controller, get player controller. Okay. And then I'm going to compile. It's going to give me an error message or a warning. Okay, so player state does not inhabit from player controller, right? So we need to player state. From the player controller, and then let's see if we can get that working. Okay, we got a check box. So, right. So that's kind of how we traversed it. So I want to try to make sure this actually works, because right now we've hooked up the cast successful. So there are two nodes to this. Like one is the successful node, which doesn't say cast success. It just has it at the top. And another is the cast failure. And so if we really want to know if it fails, if something doesn't work, we could just say fails. And so it fails to find it. But generally, if you get a check mark when you're compiling, it means there's some good stuff happening. So if I play this, well, what should happen? I should print out the value of my score. And if we go into our player state, it's 0. So I should get a 0. And I do. Excellent. Okay. So that's awesome. So just to kind of recap, if you're like, how did that just function? I mean, so essentially what I did is I'm casting. So I'm casting to our player state, which we call BP player state, and I'm passing in a player state, like the parent, basically the parent class, which is player state, and I'm passing it in directly from the player controller. And ignore this player index. That can actually be set. If we were building a multiplayer game, we would set the player index of each player here, and we can grab that. But for now, just player index 0 is fine. So we didn't actually need to go from pawn to player controller to all that. Like here, we didn't have to go all the way. We actually were able to kind of start from this point here and get to the player state. So we went to the controller, then player state. You'll get better at this. This is probably one of the more complicated examples, but now that we've got a framework, it's kind of cool, right? Because now we can communicate directly with this player state and store stuff. And so just to kind of finish up this video, what we want to do is increase the score, right? So how do we do that? Well, we kind of can figure it out. So our player score, we really want to do is we can take our player score, get it. Player get score is probably fine. Get player score. And then we do plus. And we can do increment float is good. Add 1 to the specified value, then set it. That's nice. Oh, increment integer plus. There, that's better, right? Just because we got less stuff. And so what I did here is just use this increment integer node instead of saying player score plus, plus 1 and then store that. Now we're essentially, this will do a couple things for us. It will implement it. It will increment that value. So we don't need to then set the player score. It'll set it for us. It's kind of a nice little handy thing. And then lastly, we want to print a string. And let's print out the new score, like that. Compile, and go back here, and let's just play this, and well, we should see 1. Great. And then if we do it again, we'll see 2, 2, 3, 4. And let's remove those yums. Right. So, very cool. So right, last thing we want to do, I think, just to kind of get this out of the way, and maybe even be in a place for doing some world building and some playtesting, is we should keep this print there. Is I think what I would like to do is destroy it. right? So we know the actor we hit, and then we can go ahead and at the end of this whole chain, we get rid of it. Destroy actor, not self. And so one thing you could do, but don't, is you could take this actor reference, you could just drag it all the way over here and plug it in. Don't do that. I think it would probably be better to, if we stored a reference to it and then removed it. Okay, sorry, I take it back. Do it. But do it in this way. So if we go ahead and we drag this all the way over, if you double click on one of these lines, you can create another kind of bendy point. It's not called a bendy point. I think it's called a branch or something. If you right click, there might be something that tells us reroute, right? So it's a reroute node. And what I'm doing is just kind of cleaning it up so you can read this better. Another thing that's helpful is if you, let's say we select these here and I right click, I can choose alignment. So it's even possible to straighten the connectors, which I just did there, and it makes it look a little nicer. And then just to wrap up everything, let's comment this and we say, when we collide with food, increase our score and destroy the food. Nice. So because we have this actor class, this pickup called tacos, we now have the ability to take it and just drag a few of these over to the map, right? And they're all going to inherit from this master class here. They're going to inherit all this functionality, but the functionality is actually in our player character here, not our controller. So if we play and we grab this, we see 1, and it destroyed it, 2, 3, 4, etc., etc. So I hope this was helpful. If it's confusing, don't worry too much. I mean, the most confusing concept here is like casting, and something that's a little bit annoying is that, the player state that we set in our game mode isn't the one that we're referencing immediately when we try to call player state, right? Which I didn't show you, but if you right click and you choose player state and you get the player state, that's one way that it could be done. But if you drag off and we type player score or score, oh yeah, see, it won't let you do it, which is super annoying. And you can only get score, which comes with the actual like parent class here, right? And then you can't even set it. So, but it's okay because we've learned how to cast, and that gives us a lot of power. And we've learned how to set a score, and we've learned how to increase that score. And so we're going to use this quite a bit in terms of like when we implement our health system and all sorts of other stuff. So I hope this was helpful. Thanks.